And welcome to Forum 360, our public affairs program, where we feature topics with a global outlook and a local view. I'm your host, Bill Stephen Souse. Our topic is Ohio politics and the state of presidents. Other than Virginia, Ohio has produced the largest number of presidents. And today we focus on our 20th president, James A. Garfield. And we have as our guest Dr. Todd Arrington, Ph.D. He is the site manager for the James Garfield National Historic Society, a part of the National Park Service and the Department of Interior, of course. Good to have you with us, Todd.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Dr. Arrington. James Garfield was a native of Northeast Ohio in the Western Reserve here, and he was born in Orange Township, which is in Cuyahoga County now, like Moreland Hills.
Moreland Hills
area.
now, right.
And then he finally settled in, after much time, he settled in Mentor, Ohio, up in Lake County, where your historic site is.
Right.
Tell us about the site and the Lawnfield Estate, which it was called.
Right. It's now James A. Garfield National Historic Site. As you said, we're part of the National Park Service, so we're the same people you see at the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and Yosemite.
And the
sort of those,
Cuyahoga Valley National
Cuyahoga
Park.
Valley, yes, of
Right
course.
here.
Right here in Northeast Ohio. So the property that we have now is it's only about 8 acres in size. It was once close to 160 acres. It was a farm that James and Lucretia Garfield purchased in 1876. Wow. And it was a place that they envisioned, being a place in Ohio they could come to when they were not in Washington, a place that, really I think they viewed as a retirement home for them. And then it ended up being the site from which James Garfield ran his presidential campaign in 1880 when he became we'll say, somewhat unexpected presidential candidate for the Republican Party that year.
Now, it is interesting that the James A. Garfield Historic Site became the place where the first presidential library was located. So that was a first.
Right. So to be part of the National Park Service, a site has to have something of national significance. Mm-hmm. And in our case, we're lucky enough, we actually have 2 things that are nationally significant right here in Northeast Ohio at this site. The Garfield home, which is now James A. Garfield National Historic Site, was the site of the nation's first ever front porch presidential campaign. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Garfield literally going out onto the front porch and talking to people from the porch. And then, of course, he wins the election in 1880. He's president very briefly, sadly, is assassinated. And then a few years after that, his wife, his widow, Lucretia, builds a beautiful memorial library onto the back part of the house. So that is the nation's first presidential memorial library, and we say that it is also the place where the idea for presidential libraries was born. Well,
he was one of the 4 United States presidents to be assassinated while in office.
Right.
We had Lincoln, we had Garfield,
right.
McKinley, and President Kennedy.
Right.
So there is another sad, tragic reason to think about the Garfield Memorial, the Garfield Historic Site, is because of that tragedy.
Right. I mean, we're lucky here in Northeast Ohio. We actually kind of have several sites, a sort of an informal Garfield Trail, if you will, and there's actually a great nonprofit organization now called the Garfield Trail that is trying to do philanthropic things and volunteerism for all 4 of these sites. But we do have a 4 sites right here in Northeast Ohio that really kind of encapsulate a lot of Garfield's life. Right. His birthplace, where he went to school, mm-hmm. which was then the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, is now Hiram College. Right. We have, of course, our site in Mentor, James A. Garfield National Historic Site. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, where the Garfield Memorial is located, the big, beautiful. Final resting place of the President and Mrs. Garfield.
Now, Dr. Arrington, if it is possible, could you give us a little brief outline of what he did here in Northeast Ohio before he got into politics? In his earlier days.
Yeah, well, of course, as you said, he was born here in Northeast Ohio, so he is a son of the Western Reserve, if you will. Unfortunately, his father died very young, so the future president was only about 18 months old when his father died. So he was really raised in kind of a, what we would call today a single-parent household with mm-hmm. a mother and 3 siblings. As he grew up, he got very interested in the ocean. He wanted to go to sea and live the life of a sailor. Right. The furthest he ever got was working on the Ohio and Erie Canal, wow. Which actually just runs runs right through Cuyahoga Valley National Park,
Right.
as you mentioned earlier. So he did work on the canal very briefly, didn't have a lot of success there, got very sick at one point, went back home to his mother. He was a teenager at this point, and his mother convinced him that rather than going back to that kind of work, he should try to get an education. And so he started going to school first at the Geauga Seminary in Chesterland, and then on to the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, and then eventually on to Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And then after graduating from Williams, came back to, of course, well into his 20s at this point, came back here to the Northeast Ohio, became first a teacher and then the principal of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute.
That's interesting. Now, how did you, a native of Nebraska, right, correct? And you.
Well, I didn't grow up in
You
Nebraska.
didn't grow
I
up,
lived
but
there for 10 years
you ended
working
up,
for the Park
you
Service.
lived there
yeah.
working for the Park Service, but you did go to the University of Nebraska for your background, correct?
Yeah, for graduate school, yes.
Graduate school. And how did you migrate back to Ohio? What was the path that you took?
Well, I was born in Virginia. My mom and dad are both
Okay.
from Virginia, but then we had actually lived in Ohio for several years when I was a kid. And then when I was about 10, we moved to a quiet little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yes.
Just a little bit of history there. So when I was when I was in my teenage years and I was getting interested in history, obviously the history around Gettysburg really appealed to me. And then when I was in college studying history, I worked for the National Park Service for a couple of summers there at Gettysburg. And then later, after being in the military and going to get a master's degree, got offered a permanent career Park Service position in southeast Nebraska.
Very good.
So we went out there for about 10 years. But my wife and I both are from Pennsylvania, and we wanted to get a little closer to home once we had kids and this kind of thing. So this job at James A. Garfield opened up, and I thought, well, I'm a 19th century political historian. It's closer to home, so it's got everything I want. Applied, and now have been here in Northeast Ohio for a little over 14 years.
Well, that's why we're glad you're on Forum 360 to give us the background of President Garfield. Now, he studied for the bar to become an attorney, and in 1859, the Ohio bar accepted him as a lawyer. And he became a Republican. Is that under in that era?
Yes, he was a Republican. Of course, this was the era when the parties obviously have kind of shifted philosophies and ideas several times, in fact, throughout our history. But at this point, the Republicans would have been considered if you want to use a modern term, sort of more progressive, I guess you would say. They were very concerned about the expansion of slavery, for example, into the West.
He was anti-slavery as far as his political philosophy.
He was. He had always, as
Garfield.
growing up here in Northeast Ohio, he was kind of surrounded by anti-slavery sentiment.
The Underground Railroad,
right,
bringing the African Americans north.
So he sort of latched on to that, even though for a time as a member of the Disciples of Christ, he really didn't think he should be involved in politics. When he was trying to figure out where to go to college after finishing here in what became Hiram College, a lot of people expected him to go to a different school down in Virginia that was affiliated with the Disciples of Christ. And he actually made a very conscious decision to go to Williams College in Massachusetts because he said he wanted to expose himself to different ideas.
Like a liberal arts background.
Exactly. He wanted to be in what he called the abolitionist atmosphere. And so he became much more anti-slavery at that point, never really called himself an abolitionist because there were some political connotations around that term, but he became very, very vocally anti-slavery and also overcame the idea that he should not be involved in politics while he was in Massachusetts, and then brought those ideas back here to Northeast Ohio.
Now, he did get involved politically at the state level, and then in 1861, the Civil War, the rebellion started, and he opposed slavery. What was his next step?
Well, he was the principal of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. In 1859, he also was elected to be an Ohio State Senator.
In the legislature.
In the legislature down in Columbus, so he was doing both of those things. Then when the Civil War began, April of 1861, the firing on Fort Sumter, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people on both sides, were rushing to enlist. And he was one of those folks that felt like he had an obligation to do his part. He didn't want to be left behind. And so he started trying to get into the Army and did eventually succeed. By August of 1861, about 4 months after Fort Sumter, he had been commissioned as a lieutenant colonel and then was soon a colonel and helped raise and equip a regiment, and then became its commander, and that regiment became the 42nd Ohio.
Wow. The Civil War activity, obviously he did his time as an officer, and then he left before the war ended, correct? To return to Ohio, and what further activities did he do at that?
Well, during the war, while he was serving in the Army, Republicans here in Northeast Ohio put his name forward as a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives.
Okay.
So in the fall of 1862, while he was nowhere near Ohio, he was, of course, serving in the Army, he was elected to Congress, to the House of Representatives, to represent Ohio's 19th, what was then the 19th Congressional District. But of course, at that point, he's elected in the fall of 1862, doesn't actually go to Washington, D.C. to take the seat in Congress until the very end of 1863. So he's got about 14 months in there to continue serving in the Army, and really kind of had an interesting, internal conflict and really dialogue with himself about should he stay in the Army, until the war is over, or should he go to Congress?
Yes.
And at one point he was in Washington and actually got an audience with President Abraham Lincoln and sort of put this dilemma he was having to the president. And Lincoln, of course, said, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I have plenty of generals, more generals than I know what to do with, but all the reliable Republican votes that we can get in the House is hugely important. And so Garfield then ultimately decided to go to Congress, and that's where he stayed. He stayed in the House of Representatives until he was elected president in 1880.
So as a congressman, what were some of his, do you think, some of the major issues that he dealt with? And I understand that there was some political corruption going on during that time. So what were some of the hot buttons that James Garfield dealt with as congressman?
Well, he was very young when he went to Congress. He was only in his early 30s, so he was a very young man, and he had a lot to learn, obviously, about the ways of Washington. But he got very interested in a number of issues. Foremost among them were fiscal policy. He was friendly with Salmon P. Chase, who was also an Ohioan, who was President Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. He was always passionate about education because, of course, he had sort of found himself in education by becoming a student, then becoming a teacher, then becoming what was the equivalent at that point of a college president. And then, of course, naturally, the biggest issue was the war still going on, and then after 1865, the politics of Reconstruction. And so Garfield was always a very, a rather vocal voice for the civil and political rights of formerly enslaved people. He was, for the most part, a pretty reliable, radical Republican, if you want to use that term, radical, who were really adamant about not only sort of, making the South feel that they were responsible for the war, but also providing government funds and federal protection for the civil and political rights of the formerly enslaved. So Garfield was, and was really still kind of banging that drum pretty heavily by 1880, after a lot of his Republican colleagues had started to kind of pull away from that and say, we've kind of done everything we need to do here. So, and I think that's one of the things that made him a somewhat attractive candidate in 1880.
Very good. Our program is Forum 360. Our guest is Dr. Todd Arrington, Ph.D. He is the site manager for the National Park Service, which is under the U.S. Department of Interior here in the Western Reserve in Northeast Ohio. And it is the James A. Garfield National Historic Site, which houses the Presidential Library in Mentor, Ohio. And it's on Mentor Avenue, which is US 20, Highway 20. He has information to talk about the 20th President of the United States. Now, we see, which you say you have a display of his campaign information there, and when he was running for president with Chester Arthur. So tell us a little bit about his campaigning style, and you alluded to the fact that he did do the porch campaigns back in Mentor. A little bit about what happened as he was approaching the presidency there.
Well, the most interesting thing about Garfield in 1880 is that he really wasn't seeking the presidency. In fact, in early 1880, January of that year, he'd actually been elected to the U.S. Senate. So after about 17 years in the House of Representatives, the Ohio legislature, because of course at this point the legislature's elected senators, not the people. He'd been elected to the Senate, so he was going to the U.S. Senate at the beginning of 1881. In 1880, in the summer of 1880, he went to the Republican National Convention in Chicago as really an advocate for the candidacy of a guy named John Sherman. John Sherman at that point was Secretary of the Treasury. John Sherman, of course, also an Ohioan. He was the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, the famous Civil War general. So Garfield went to Chicago to that convention to help manage Sherman's campaign on the floor. And then that convention became very fractured because none of the major candidates had enough votes in the convention to get the nomination. And so the convention started looking for a compromise candidate. And eventually, and I say eventually because it took 36 ballots, they came around to nominating James Garfield. So, he was the first presidential candidate in American history who was actually present at the convention that nominated him. The norms of the era said, you don't want to appear too eager to be president, so you don't go to the convention, you don't campaign for yourself.
Let others promote.
Let others do the work for you. The parties really did the work of the campaigns at this point. So he actually ends up sitting on the floor of the convention, sort of flabbergasted that now all of a sudden he's presidential candidate. Now, there were a few people that had sort of whispered that he would be a great compromise candidate long before this convention. So he wasn't completely out of the blue. He certainly wasn't an unknown quantity here. I mean, he was, he'd been in Congress for 17 years. He was going to the Senate. But I think that, I do think it was a genuine shock to him when he was nominated, because if he thought he was really going to be nominated, he would have been nowhere near that convention.
And then the Republicans under Garfield and Arthur were successful against Hancock, correct? And what was their the Democrats, what was their agenda at the time?
Well, yeah, so Garfield becomes the presidential nominee. Chester A. Arthur from New York becomes the vice presidential nominee, and there's some very interesting history there as well about the different factions in the Republican Party at this point, and these two guys being from different factions. The Democrats nominated Winfield Scott Hancock, who was a career Army officer, West Point graduate, had served nobly in the Mexican-American War, in the Civil War. And it's really interesting because this is 1880. This is the only election in our history where both major candidates were Civil War veterans.
Civil War veterans and officers, high rank.
So, Garfield, the Republicans have have kind of a built-in campaign tactic at this point in American history, which is we just remind everyone that the Democrats were the party of slavery, the party of secession, the party of treason. They kind of called that waving the bloody shirt, reminding everyone that these traitors put 300,000 Union soldiers in their graves. So here's James Garfield, who has a war record and a fairly impressive one, but he's running against a guy who was a Union general, a career Army officer who fought and was wounded and nearly died fighting for the Union. You cannot wave the bloody shirt at Winfield Scott Hancock.
But it became apparent that James Garfield and Chester Arthur did have a significant victory, though. Correct?
Their popular vote victory was razor thin. I mean, we're talking something less than 10,000 votes.
But their electoral college?
In the electoral college, it was a significant victory. So, they won where they needed to win.
They had enough delegates. Significant number of delegates.
Correct.
Now, there was some political infighting and intrigue, and I know you're, Dr. Arrington, you're very knowledgeable of the Republican Party during that part of the 19th century, the late half of the 1800s. And there was a group called the Stalwarts. Tell us a little bit about that, because that became a crucial problem in the life of Garfield at that point, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that goes all the way back to even to the Republican Convention in 1880. The Stalwarts and then the other group which were sort of derisively called the half-breeds because they were considered half-breed Republicans. They were, really frankly, on most issues, they were in agreement. The Stalwarts wanted Ulysses S. Grant to run for president again in 1880. They wanted him to be the nominee. He'd already been president for 2 terms, left for 4 years. They wanted him to run again. The half-breeds did not want a 3rd term for anybody, even Grant. The other issue that was really creating a bit of a rift between these two was civil service reform. the stalwarts liked the existing patronage system, the spoils system, if you will, where when we win elections, we can give whoever we want jobs. Doesn't matter if they're qualified or have any experience.
Right. Patronage.
Patronage, exactly.
You scratch my back, I'll give you.
Exactly. The stalwarts loved that system because it helped them build bases of power. The half-breeds were starting to come around on the idea that maybe there's a better way to do this. Maybe these folks should be loyal to the Constitution and not to whatever congressman or senator gave them their job. And that was a slow process. Garfield, frankly, was considered a half-breed at this point, really because he didn't think Grant should run again. He didn't think anybody should run for a third term. Garfield was fairly lukewarm on civil service reform at this point. When Garfield started to come around on civil service reform was after he won the election of 1880 and after he became president, because he saw how much time, how many hours every day he had to spend seeing people who wanted to make their case for a job, from consuls in different countries all the way down to postmasters in small towns. Right. The custom of the day was, if you went to see the president, he serves the people, he must see you. And so you can read in his diary, the more time goes by, people started showing up at his house in Mentor, where we are, when he was president-elect, and then after he was inaugurated, they did the same at the White House. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So you can read his diaries and his letters and just see him getting more and more frustrated about what a waste of time this is. That's really, I think, when Garfield started coming around to, yes, there probably should be a better system for this.
Wow. Now, how did his wife, did she work with him on campaigns, or what was the family life?
Well, Lucretia Rudolph Garfield was James Garfield's wife. They were married in 1858, and of course stayed married until his death. They had 7 children total. 5 of those children survived to adulthood, so they did lose 2 young children in childhood. And she was his partner every step of the way. Again, the customs of this era did not really allow for women to be politically vocal, or at least the wives of politicians to be politically vocal. Behind the scenes, we know that she had opinions and she shared them with him, and she was certainly was a great partner to him, in that she thought that he was brilliant, and then he was destined for greatness, and so she was very supportive of that.
Wow.
She also, of course, had to worry about, she has 5 young children. His mother was still alive, living with them. Eventually, her father came to live with them as well. So she had her hands full with a lot of other things, but she was supportive of everything that he wanted to do.
How was their involvement in the White House when they arrived in Washington, D.C. to take the White House as their residence? That probably was a transition for Lucretia and James.
It certainly was. It was a transition for them in Mentor during the summer of 1880, when all of these thousands of people started coming to hear him speak as part of the Front Porch Campaign. It was a little overwhelming for the family. And then once they went to Washington, of course, they had been in Washington off and on for years. Right. So she is not someone coming to Washington with no knowledge of how
because of their congressional work.
Right, exactly. So, she knew about the social obligations of the First Lady and these kinds of things. But, she was very interested in, she was going to be doing some redecorating of the White House. And so they would very often go together to the Library of Congress and check out books and, for ideas on things that they wanted to do with the residents. She unfortunately, just a few months into the presidency, got sick. Ended up having malaria. So she spent a lot of her time in the White House, and of course it was a relatively brief time, ultimately, because of him being shot.
Right, in July, they entered the White House earlier in the year, and then in 1881 in July, tell us about this assassin.
Yeah. So unfortunately, on July 2nd, 1881, Garfield was shot in a train station in Washington, D.C. The assassin's name was Charles Guiteau, and he's an interesting character, to say the least. There's no question he was mentally unstable. He also had political motivations. He considered himself a stalwart Republican.
Okay.
And he was one of those guys that had wanted to see Grant get reelected.
Not the half-breeds.
Right. He was not a half-breed. He was a stalwart, according to him. And so he was, but he became convinced that he had been very, very helpful in Garfield winning the state of New York, which was the important
And
state.
he did not get the position that he wanted.
He wanted a job. He didn't, he was told several times this isn't going to happen. He wanted to be the American consul to Paris or Vienna, which was ridiculous. And so eventually decided that, God was talking to him and was telling him that the best way to save the country and save the Republican Party from James Garfield, from the half-breeds, from civil service reform, was simply to murder the President of the United States. That would elevate the Vice President, Chester A. Arthur, who was a stalwart Republican, into the presidency. So when Guiteau shot Garfield on July 2nd, 1881, he shot him and then basically stood there and said, I did it, I'm a stalwart, and Arthur will be president.
Tragic end. He actually lived a few more months, correct, Dr. Arrington?
Yeah.
And eventually he succumbed to his wounds. And I appreciate your bringing all this to our attention because he is one of the two assassinated presidents, both President Garfield, our 20th president, and later President McKinley, to be assassinated. And it was sad that this happens, but both the president's family was able to work with the federal government to have this historic site. Again, tell us how to, the best way to get to the historic site. It's in Mentor, Ohio. We only have a second or two.
Sure.
Mentor, Ohio.
Yep, in Mentor on Route 20. We're impossible to miss right there on Mentor Avenue. And then, of course, people can find us online and on social media as well.
Thank you, Dr. Arrington.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.